Today, we become legends.
Smite 2 is still young at this point, but has already had its fair share of completely broken god releases, with plenty more to come if Smite 1 was an example. Let's take a look at the top 5 most overpowered god releases we've seen so far in Smite 2, and why they were so strong. So kicking off the list at number 5, we have our most recent god that I'll discuss for the video, though still not too recent, and that is Kali. For Kali's release in Smite 2, the team wanted to add a new dimension to her gameplay and builds, with intelligence scaling and the rupture mechanic. As with most new mechanics that the team wants to push, they released it completely and utterly overpowered. Whether or not you think that's intentional is your own call. Kali's Incense went from a solid ability in Smite 1 to arguably the single best basic ability in the entire game on her release, thanks to the absolutely absurd numbers it had. On release, this ability, when consuming 5 rupture stacks, which is not hard to do at all, dealt a total of 152.5% int scaling and 82.5% strength scaling. The strength scaling is fairly reasonable and just added a little bit extra on top, as the double stacking Transcendence and Book build was the way to go for Kali on release, and she ended up with around an extra 100 strength just from trans. The main thing here though was that absolutely absurd 152.5% int scaling, which could easily be hitting for close to 1000 damage at full build just from int scaling alone. Add on the base damage and a bit from strength scaling and it was easily clearing 1000 damage. But that's not everything, of course. 1000 damage on an unmissable ability is nice and all, but this also stunned, granted 38 strength and 55 int for 6 seconds, healed her for 190 plus 35% int, and had a base 14-second cooldown. Pretty much every component of this ability has since been nerfed. The base damage went down by 25, the base strength scaling went down by 5%, the base int scaling went down by 10%, the strength scaling per stack went down by 2.5%, 12.5% total, the int scaling per stack went down by 10%, 50% total, the base heal went down by 30, the heal per stack went down by 6 for a total of 30, the heal int scaling per stack went down from 3%, 15% total, the free strength went down by 8, the free int went down by 13, and the cooldown went up by 1 second. This might be the single most nerfed ability ever across both games. At the very least, it's the most nerfed in Smite 2's history. The bulk of release Kali's Insanity was on the 3 for sure, but she also took some fairly significant nerfs in other areas too, such as her passive healing being cut in half, her 1 applying 2 rupture stacks instead of 3 and having its healing nerfed from 10% missing health to 6%, as well as a base heal nerf and a cooldown increase of 1 second, and her ultimate's damage scaling was also brought down on both the strength and int components. And after all that, Kali is still a very strong force in the current meta of Smite 2. Granted, the intelligence burst build is generally not used anymore, and Kali is stronger either with a melee shredder build or with the aspect as an ADC, but it's crazy that after all these nerfs, she's still super strong, and that will be a recurring theme throughout this list. Such as my next pick at the number 4 spot for the list, where we have the latest brand new god release for Smite 2, that being Princess Barry, and boy was she broken on release and is still strong to this day despite many nerfs. Barry's kit in general just feels like one of those designs that will always be strong unless they completely gut her numbers to unreasonably low levels. Having a passive that gives free stats and ability casts, no mana requirement, and an ultimate with team-wide death immunity is just going to always be strong, but on release her numbers were even more crazy than they are now. One thing to note with Barry in terms of changes is that over time the team have shifted her to more intelligence scaling but less strength scaling. You could argue this isn't necessarily a straight up nerf, but in a lot of cases it is, as if she was doing the same ability damage with a strength build, she is also then chunking you with auto attacks which can be AoE from her passive. Making it so you have to build intelligence to get her high ability damage is mostly a nerf for this reason. We'll see that first with the 3, which is a large part of why Barry's overall kit was so strong, especially on release. This originally had 130% strength scaling and 40% int scaling, which has since been shifted to be 95 strength and 55 int, as well as the cooldown has been increased from 15 seconds flat to 17 down to 15. So yeah, this basically means that if you want to build her strength ability base, which also hits hard with auto attacks, you're going to be dealing less crazy damage, which is a big deal as the strength ability base build was by far Barry's best build for a long time until these strength nerfs and int buffs started adding up. And we now see a lot more int Barry. The passive was nerfed in a very similar way, losing some attack speed and strength but gaining some intelligence. Her 1 and 2 again got similar changes, and the ultimate was the same but of a larger magnitude, similar to her 3, with the strength scaling going down from 30% per hit and 60 on the final final hit to 20% per hit and 40 on the final hit, with some int scaling buffs to compensate. I know I'm harping on this less strength, more int thing a lot, but it's important to understand these Barry nerfs, since if you take them at face value, they look like just shifts and nothing too major. She lost in one area but gained in another, but you have to keep in mind that strength ability based Barry was by far her best build and half the reason she was so broken on release. If you nerf a god's best build and buff their weakest build, the god gets overall weaker, and that's the main approach they've taken to nerfing Barry. It might not seem like a lot on the surface, but in reality it changes a lot for her. They also just straight up nerf the ult in a few other ways as well, such as a cooldown increase from 100 seconds to 110, the Mystic Surge duration from 10 seconds to 7, and completely removing the slow component from the ability. All of this, and Barry is still an incredibly strong god in the right hands that gets banned pretty frequently even to this day. For sure one of the most overpowered god releases we've had in Smite 2, but believe it or not, she doesn't really even come close to the top 3 who are on another level of broken. Such as my number 3 pick for the list, Baron Samedi, which if you were around for this guy's release during the closed alpha phase, you might already be writing your comments saying it's insane to put him only at number 3. But trust me, it gets even worse than release Baron further up the list. That's not to undersell this release though. Baron's launch pretty much turned the game into who has the better Baron player. This was in a time where we had way fewer gods in the game than we do now, and there wasn't anything even close to Baron's power level at the time to compete with him. Not to mention he plays 3 roles, so there was basically no chance there wasn't a Baron in your match somewhere. I do need to set the stage for this one a little bit. In Closed Alpha 3, Baron's release patch, the team identified that cooldown rate was underperforming in general, and in true high-res fashion, they went a little overboard with buffs to CDR items, almost doubling the CDR offered by some options, and at minimum 1.5xing the stat across the board. This led to a meta where spamming as many CDR items into your build as possible was the best way to play the game. I can't help but think this was intentionally timed, as they also released Yamoja and Baron Samedi in this patch. Yamoja relies heavily on CDR for Omi generation, and Baron got a new kind of scaling for his Smite 2 release, CDR scaling. The more CDR you have, the more Baron's 2 heals for. Since the best way to play the game already for every role except ADC in this patch was to build 4 to 5 CDR items, Baron 2 was frequently healing for half health per cast due to all that CDR, and it was on like a 4 to 5 second cooldown as well due to that CDR. Baron was basically unkillable on release due to this. If he ever got low, the missing health scaling that was boosted by CDR healed off basically all of the damage you just dealt to him. They also added max health scaling to Baron's ultimate for Smite 2, which meant that even tank Baron was doing absolutely ridiculous damage. The ultimate also had more max health scaling, more protection scaling, a longer stun duration, and was on a 70-second base cooldown at max rank for seemingly no reason on release. Baron's brew was also given its new effect of being throwable, and while this was far from the most broken part of his kit, it dealt way more damage than it ever should have done on release and was nerfed pretty heavily down to the numbers it now has. However, arguably the biggest factor to Baron's release was actually a bug that went undiscovered for months and was silently making him 10 times better than his numbers suggested he should be. For Baron's Smite 2 release, they changed his Hysteria passive a little bit. In Smite 1, high Hysteria targets took bonus damage from Baron. For Smite 2, they removed that and just added the damage to his base kit to compensate so that he basically dealt the same damage as before but wasn't reliant on Hysteria to do so. They replaced this with an effect that made high Hysteria targets do less damage to Baron himself. The bug, they would actually do less damage to everything, not just Baron. This is a 20% reduction, which is absolutely massive, and that meant not only did Baron take 20% reduced damage, his entire team did as well, and even objectives, structures, minions, and jungle camps will be taking 20% reduced damage from most of the enemy team. Yeah, it turns out that just having a Baron on your team making the entire enemy team do 20% less damage across the board was pretty good, and as mentioned, this bug went unfound for months after his release, leading to more Baron nerfs than were really necessary, and when they finally fixed this bug, Baron was actually in a terrible state for a while and received several buffs and reverts to previous nerfs to compensate. Even without this bug, Baron would have been a very strong release, but with this on top of that, he was one of the most broken releases we've ever seen and probably ever will see in Smite 2. Never say never though, Smite is no stranger to releasing completely broken gods. Moving on though, next up at the number 2 spot we have Hunbats, and boy was this release a doozy. Shortly after Hunbat's release, they stopped launching gods with aspects on day 1, and I can't help but think he is a large part of why they did that. Hunbat's aspect on release was just complete insanity, but we'll get to that in a second. First up, let's discuss the base kit and all the +1s it got coming into Smite 2. The first and by far most major change that Hunbat's got was his 2 shredding protections during the channel. On release, this ability shredded off 24 protections from the target, which, considering that the team has made a deliberate effort to remove flat penetration from builds in Smite 2, giving Bats 24 free flat penetration for whenever he casts his 2 essentially just made him the most damaging jungler regardless of what else he could do. 10 flat penetration on Jotun's Wrath was apparently too strong to remain in the game. Imagine what 24 flat penetration does for him. And hell, Well, it's even better than that, as its protection shreds, so it increases all physical damage the enemy takes, not just from Hunbats. This has since been nerfed down to 16 flat shred and is still ridiculously good. Bat's also got a couple of smaller but less relevant plus ones, with his passive now giving a stacking strength buff of up to 28 depending on level, as well as his one now dealing damage as he leaps away as well as landing, which combined with the fact that you can now pre-channel his 2 and teleport in right before it hits to allow for some degenerate fake engage strategies that Smite 2 Hunbats is now known for. When you throw your 3, pre-channel your 2, teleport in right as it hits, then jump back out with your 1, doing amazing damage with very little risk. This has also since been nerfed. It used to do full damage on the first hit, 25% damage on the second hit. It now deals 25% damage on takeoff, 100% on landing, which essentially takes away 75% strength scaling from this fake engage combo and makes it much less prevalent. You now have to actually leap onto someone to get the big damage, rather than leaping away and still deleting people. All this, of course, was also combined with the fact that Hunbats, as he did in Smite 1, has one of the most powerful ultimates in the entire game for teamfights that can completely decimate teams on its own, and once again has been majorly nerfed since his release, as it now can only fear for a maximum of 1 second, whereas before the nerf it could fear for the full lifetime of 2 seconds when placed well. All of that by itself would have made for a super broken release, but it probably wouldn't have placed number 2 on this list without one key factor: Hunbat's aspect. This aspect on launch was just silly and outright better than base Hunbats in almost every way. Adding an extra stun to his kit basically for free was always going to be a bad idea, and there was next to no trade-off for this on launch. He lost the strength from his passive and traded it for a slow, which is not a big deal and arguably an upgrade in some cases, and the damage of his 2 was reduced very slightly in base and scaling, but not by anywhere near enough to justify giving him an 8-second cooldown unmissable 1.25 second stun. Which, yes, this ability on launch with or without aspect was an 8-second base cooldown at max rank. This is now 10 seconds without aspect and a whopping 14 seconds with the aspect. Oh, and the stun duration also went down from 1.25 seconds to 0.75 seconds since release. It also now has pitiful base damage and scaling with the aspect on, which is how it always should have been. Losing a tiny bit of damage was never going to justify adding a free stun to this ability that is completely unmissable. So yeah, Hunbats is probably the second most nerfed god of all time in Smite 2, and for good reason. He was completely and utterly broken on launch and peaked at a 66% win rate in ranked, which is just absurd. All this, and Hunbats is still a very strong jungle pick to this day. This release was just complete insanity, and it was a tough choice to not place it at number 1, but I think there's one release that eclipses even this. Before we get to that though, a few honorable mentions for picks that I heavily considered for the list, but ultimately didn't quite make it in favor of stronger releases. Those being Poseidon's release, where his 2 was on a 10-second cooldown, and due to the amount of CDR in the game at the time, was easily able to be kept permanently active, as well as the triple wave doing absolutely absurd damage on release that was since heavily nerfed. Fenrir was one of the strongest gods in the original alpha release due to overtuned numbers and a lack of counterplay to his brutalize among the roster. Medusa, Jingwei, and Hu Yi were all incredibly strong ADC releases, and finally we have Aphrodite, who broke the game like we all thought she would on launch and took significant nerfs in the following patches. But finally, the most overpowered and broken god release so far in Smite 2 has to be the Sultan of Slaughter, Aladdin. This guy on release was just so obviously overtuned in his numbers, which is crazy considering his core kit has more mechanics and effects than almost any god in the history of both Smite 1 and Smite 2. A fundamentally broken kit with broken numbers on top of that was a recipe for disaster, and boy was release Aladdin something else. Even just looking at the release numbers for his 2 alone is all you need to hear, really. This ability had a total damage of 700 base plus 200% intelligence and 290% strength on release. Even now, it's an incredibly strong ability that will absolutely delete you if Aladdin can stay in range for all the punches. But on release, this was out damaging entire god's base kits on its own. Neith's entire base kit, including a weave explosion from her 1, deals 860 base plus 225% int and 155% strength. Slightly higher base damage and int scaling, but dramatically lower strength scaling, to where in most cases Aladdin's 2 alone would hit harder than Neith's entire base kit rotation. His 1 was no slouch either, dealing 432 base plus 153% of both scalings, which might seem paltry in comparison to his 2, but this is far beyond almost any other basic ability in the game, and the damage of the 1 is much easier to confirm compared to the 2, and can be done from range with very little risk to Aladdin himself. This ability on release would frequently half health backliners with the refire, even more if Aladdin was fed, which of course he was in most games because he was completely fucking broken. And then of course the base kit damage can be leveraged to the tits by Aladdin's ultimate, which is in some ways the most broken ability ever added to Smite, and probably the most nerfed ability as well. Even in its current heavily nerfed form, this ability is crazy good. On release though, it healed him up to 80% and the enemy only up to 40% at max rank. Now it's just 50% for for both you and the enemy. This can't be overstated really. There's basically no chance Aladdin loses that 1v1 when it's 80% health versus 40%. But at 50-50, it's much more winnable if the enemy plays it well. It also had a 90-second base cooldown at max rank on release, which with how available CDR was at the time would frequently get down to around 40 seconds in the late game, meaning it's up for every fight, sometimes even twice in one fight if it's a long one. They also nerfed various other aspects of this ability, such as the cell CDR and enemy CDR, the self protections, and as I said, the cooldown as well. This was base 90 seconds on release, it's now 110 seconds down to 100 based on rank. Even now, Aladdin is still strong and will likely forever be a relevant force in Smite 2's meta, just because of how his kit fundamentally breaks the game in so many ways and the power that his wishes bring to the table. But the fact that he also released with some of the most absurd numbers we've ever seen in Smite 2, or even in Smite 1 for that matter, it just tipped him over the edge into being the absolute most broken god release in Smite 2 so far. Even now, Aladdin remains one of the best junglers in the game in high level play, despite taking probably the most heavy and numerous rounds of nerfs we've ever seen in Smite 2, with the only god coming close really being Bass. Could Aladdin be topped? Absolutely. Never say never when it comes to OP god releases in Smite, but as it stands, this god was definitely the most OP release in Smite 2 so far. But what do you think? Are there any releases I missed here that you would have put on the list? If so, why? Let me know down below and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day and peace out, you nerds.